what are these people playing at? When you have a job in one of the most significant buildings in the country, let alone your own constituency, if not the most significant building in the country, what are you playing at, thinking you can get away with all of this? And what are you playing at, not just getting on with the job of serving the people that you're supposed to serve in this time? Everybody has a personal life, and everybody can make mistakes, and everybody can have, a sex life that's their own, and all of that, whatever they choose to do, as long as it's not illegal or harming people. But this is more than that, isn't it? This particular case, and so many other cases like it. Some of them aren't to do with sleaze, with sex. Some of them are to do with financial corruption or favours being given, or the whole Owen Paterson lobbying crisis that really hurtled Boris Johnson to the exit door, seems to me, or certainly began the process of hurtling him to the exit door when he was Prime Minister. So there's what are they playing at? And there's also, from your perspective as a voter, who do you most think of when I say sleaze, corruption and dishonesty? I mean, in a sense, the Conservative government, because it's been in power for 14 years, will obviously get your most immediate attention, perhaps not. But you tell me, 0345 6060 973. I say sleaze. Which party comes to mind? You can send a WhatsApp message on that number as well, and text 84850. I'm joined by Rafael Behr first, political columnist and author of Politics, A Survivor's Guide. Rafael, we're seeing quite a few politicians not surviving it, really, aren't we? Increasingly.
Well, yeah, it's interesting, as you were just saying, what do you think of when you say sleaze? And certainly for me, that very word plunges me right back to the mid-1990s. I think that's when that term became associated with politics, and it became associated with the last years of the John Major government, sliding into the abyss towards inevitable defeat. And I think I'm probably not alone when having read about this latest scandal and these allegations, thinking one of my first thoughts was, are they almost deliberately trying to reenact that atmosphere of the late 90s? I mean, it feels like such a throwback to that time when it just seemed that every few weeks there was another MP that you hadn't heard of before. I mean, that's always the interesting thing. He's not a cabinet minister, and they're not necessarily household names. It's exactly as you just described a moment ago, this fascinating phenomenon of the kind of, I mean, this is going to sound perhaps a bit brutal, but the kind of no mark, hasn't really risen very far MP, possibly in a safe seat, sort of trundling along the bottom of their political career.
But to be fair to some MPs who never get to ministerial levels, they can be brilliant constituency MPs doing the job,
That's absolutely right. And he might have been a brilliant constituency MP and might well still be. What is interesting, I think, and this isn't actually my observation, it's something that has been shared with me by MPs and others who observe this. There is, I think, a kind of psychological phenomenon that happens when you get into the House of Commons, when you're sort of the biggest person in politics locally, and then you get sort of subsumed into the Palace of Westminster, and you're no one. You're right at the bottom of the pyramid, and it's very disorienting. And I think there is, I mean, a sort of a psychological trait that kicks in where the people who are attracted to this, or for whatever reason, they become almost thrill-seeking risk takers. That sense of the extraordinary, fascinating thing about this is that how on earth do people think they're going to get away with this, and how do they not realize at some stage it's going to be public? It's almost as if it's a syndrome almost.
Or they wield an MP somewhere else because wielding it in the halls of Westminster isn't quite paying off.
Yeah, and exactly. And I think at a certain point, it's very hard to retain your grip on what you and I, sort of in quotes, normal people would think of as the kind of reality. You're in a bubble. You're sort of often shuttling between Westminster and your constituency. And in a sense, I don't know this MP. I don't know a lot of personally MPs who get caught up in these scandals. But when you read what's being alleged and what seems to have happened to this guy, I think there's almost an element of compassion needs to be brought to it. It doesn't sound like a story of a happy, healthy person, frankly. And this is often the case with these MPs. It seems like actually their lives are not in good shape, and there's almost a failure of duty of care. I mean, also ultimately, if you're spending donors' money bailing yourself out of all sorts of hideous scandals, then that also might be a question for plot. But I think that it's complicated, actually, it's sort of emotionally and psychologically as well as politically.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Because, as you say, compassion demands that none of us expects anybody else to be absolutely perfect and always get things right and never have, trouble or even disasters in their lives. That hopefully is a given. But in politics, there are some particular requirement, particularly the higher you get, that there should be, shouldn't there, some particular requirements of how you conduct yourself, particularly if during the difficult times that we've experienced as a nation, you're the people who are supposed to be seeing us through it. And if you find that what you've got is, broken people, that's not great, is it? It's not great for the country.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I do think I would sort of, as it were, precede everything I said a moment ago with the observation that you choose this life out of public service, out of a duty to your constituents, and so the basic apparent total dereliction of that duty is the sort of the headline, is the beginning of the story, but also I think there's a systemic issue here in terms of who is being attracted to do this in the first place. What is the mechanism by which we're choosing people? And it's very interesting. I mean, again, in this particular case, it was a safe seat, and he's been an MP since was selected when David Cameron was leader of the party. But often what happens, and you saw this with the Labour Party when Jeremy Corbyn was leader, you saw it in the 2019 landslide when the Conservatives won lots of seats they didn't necessarily expect to win. You can have people selected to be MPs where they don't necessarily think they're going to win, or sometimes the majority is bigger than anyone thought, and no one's really kind of kicked the tires on the candidacies. They sort of swept up people who are sort of ideologically supportive, and that's good enough, or they come from the right faction within the party, and so you prefer them to someone who might actually be maybe a bit boring, not necessarily agree with you on Europe or the nuclear deterrent or whatever it is, but is actually also sane and rational and able to do the job. And you go with the wrong candidate. And so there's something
tribalism
about
tribalism
exactly.
within part. Well,
what is the ideological criteria rather than professional criteria?
And the ability criteria, yeah. I mean, if you look at Labour, for example, just a quick list. Jared O'Mara, back in February 2023, found guilty of making fraudulent expenses claims to fund a, quotes, galloping cocaine habit. Conor McGinn has the whip suspended over a complaint was lodged against him under the party's independent complaints process. Claudia Webb, expelled from the party last year after being found guilty of a harassment campaign against a love rival, and the list goes on. And I could give you the list, another list from Labour. Boris Johnson accused of presiding over a record 100 COVID fines in 2022. Matt Hancock, Michelle Mone, Rishi Sunak accused of shielding the super rich by maintaining non-dom tax loophole, and of course his own wife's situation as well. Owen Paterson, I mentioned, breaking the paid lobbying rules. If you go further back, Lib Dems, Lord Renard, I mean, there will be flawed people, and there will be people who get it so wrong that they have to be removed or disciplined in some way. But do you think there is something about the selection well, you touched on it there. The selection process is sometimes too ideological or too personal. I want people who look and sound like me to be in the party. Do you think that's a big part of it? Who we select, who the parties select in the first place?
I think there's definitely an element of that. It's also incredibly difficult to become an MP, and incredibly expensive as well. I mean, that's the other thing. So, if you want to be selected as a candidate in a winnable seat, you have to actually raise quite a lot of money. Often in the Labour context, that means really you have to have the sponsorship of one of the big trade unions. In the Conservative context, it means you really have to work this network of private donors. So before you're even elected as an MP, you're starting to operate in an environment where one of the first things you have to think about is who are you doing favors for, and how are you going to get enough money in an account that means you can literally just fight the campaign in the first place. And I don't think that's necessarily corrupt. I mean, trade unions represent working people. That's perfectly legitimate. Businesses might want to donate to the Conservative Party because they believe in the principles of Conservative administration.
But it can create a really sort of siloed thinking, can't it? And siloed experience that most of us hopefully don't have in our working life, and don't need to please people to that degree in our working life.
Well, and also, I think culturally, especially when you put it in the context of very tribal politics, very partisan politics, where people will just hate you because of the color of the rosette you're wearing, not even knowing anything about you, you also have to develop a very thick skin. You have to quite early on just assume that people are criticizing you because they're always going to do that and they're just on the other side. And you basically have, not only can you ignore what they're saying because they're the wrong team, you have to ignore what they're saying for the sake of your own sort of mental health. And it makes people, it's very hard when you've got that thickness of skin and you're operating in that environment to take a step back and look at yourself and thinking, hang on, what have I become here? What am I actually doing? I think very few people, I think, have that presence of mind and that capacity to always retain the perspective. And if they are already a bit flawed or a bit damaged, exhausted, vulnerable, or whatever, or greedy, whatever else it is, you can see how they end up spiraling into these terrible situations.
Just really briefly, if you would, I read your book last summer. I mean, it's, and which I enjoyed it very much. I know the paperback is out. The paperback is out. Is the conclusion of your book that our politics is sick and needs to be healed in some way?
Yes, I think it is, but also that it can be, that it's not fatally ill. It's a chronic syndrome that can be where recovery is available. But I've worked as a foreign correspondent in countries where politics is in a much, much worse shape, and we shouldn't just sort of write ours off because actually we're a democracy with a lot going for it.
We'll end on some optimism and see what comes through on the calls. Thanks very much, Rafael.